He was a powerful millionaire, but a poor flower seller changed his life forever. Before the story begins, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. New York at night. The city glows with millions of dazzling lights from towering skyscrapers piercing the dark sky. Wide avenues are packed with traffic, where sleek sports cars speed past, leaving faint trails of light on the damp pavement after the evening rain. Here, everything has a price, and everyone is racing against time to maintain their position. Amidst this modern metropolis, Liam Carter steps out of a sleek black Bentley, its engine almost silent as it comes to a halt in front of the tallest building in Manhattan. He is tall, his sharp features sculpted like a masterpiece, his tailored suit pristine and unwrinkled. His face remains composed, but his deep-set eyes are distant, cold, and unreadable. Liam is not the type to stop and observe the world around him. To him, everything must have a purpose, and its value is measured by its ability to generate profit. Numbers, contracts, billion-dollar deals, that is his world. Yet, just as he is about to enter his building, something unusual catches his eye. Across the street, a wealthy woman, wrapped in a luxurious fur coat, an expensive handbag dangling from her wrist, stands in front of a small flower stand, her expression tight with dissatisfaction. She holds a bouquet in her manicured hands, shakes her head in disapproval, and then shoves it back toward the vendor. That vendor, Clara. Under the soft glow of a street lamp, she is noticeably smaller than the elegant woman before her. She wears a simple, slightly worn sweater, clean but faded jeans, and a thin knitted scarf draped over her shoulders. She has no place in this extravagant city, except for her eyes. Eyes that burn with determination, stronger than any skyscraper standing behind her. A dispute unfolds. The wealthy woman demands a lower price, arguing that she can buy flowers for much less at a supermarket. But Clara remains unfazed. She grips the bouquet firmly, her lips pressing together in quiet defiance. No concessions, no compromises. The chaos of the city drowns out their voices. Honking cars, the sharp clack of high heels against the pavement, hurried phone calls. But Liam doesn't need to hear them. He can read their body language. The wealthy woman loses patience. Frustrated, she throws the bouquet onto the stand and storms off, her expensive heels clicking against the sidewalk like a final declaration of victory. But Clara doesn't flinch. She simply picks up the bouquet, gently dusts off the petals that had been disturbed, and places it back in its spot. No disappointment, no sorrow, just calm acceptance, as if she has faced moments like this 1,000 times before. That is the moment when Liam stops in his tracks. For the first time in a very long time, he looks at someone. Not for business, not for profit. This girl, she is different. She is unlike anyone in his world. She doesn't plead, she doesn't fear, and she doesn't care about those who hold more power than her. She defines her own worth. And that is what makes Liam unable to look away. The rain had just stopped. Droplets clung to the pavement, reflecting the glow of the streetlights, creating an ethereal shimmer, like thousands of tiny jewels scattered across the ground. Cars sped past, their tires slicing through puddles, sending sprays of water into the damp, heavy air of a New York night. Across the street, amidst the dazzling cityscape, there was a small space that felt different. Clara stood there, her thin woolen scarf draped loosely over her shoulders, her fingers delicately arranging the flowers in an old wicker basket. She wasn't rushed, she wasn't anxious. It was as if the chaotic world around her couldn't touch her. Liam Carter watched from a distance. He didn't understand himself. A man like him, who meticulously planned every second of his day, was now standing in the biting cold, watching a street flower vendor. What was so special about her? It wasn't beauty in the conventional sense, the kind of polished, alluring charm he often saw in the women of his social circle. Clara's allure was different. It wasn't about appearance, but something else. Something in the way her eyes held an unshaken resolve, in the way she stood with an unwavering posture, in the quiet defiance that made her completely indifferent to the judging eyes around her. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She didn't need to. Liam took a deep breath and stepped forward. The soft click of his leather shoes echoed against the pavement, but Clara didn't look up. She continued adjusting the flowers, her focus unwavering, as if she hadn't even noticed him. For the first time in his life, Liam felt invisible. He wasn't used to this. When he entered a room, people paused. They noticed. But Clara, she didn't even bother to glance at him. Something unfamiliar stirred within him. Not frustration, curiosity. He stood there for a long moment, silently observing the way she worked. Her fingers moved swiftly, skillfully smoothing out the petals of bruised flowers. Every bloom seemed to hold value in her hands. Then, suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the street, sending a flurry of discarded flyers tumbling through the air. A small white flower slipped from Clara's basket, rolling gently onto the wet pavement. Liam reacted instinctively. He bent down and picked it up. The petals were still damp, fragile under the glow of the street lamp. He straightened and held the flower out to her. This time, Clara looked up. Their eyes met. 1 second. 2 seconds. In that brief moment, Liam realized something strange. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no nervousness, no curiosity, just indifference. She didn't look at him as a wealthy man, not as a potential customer, not even as a stranger to be wary of. She looked at him as if he were nothing special. And for the first time in his life, Liam felt something he had never felt before. He felt challenged. The city hummed around them, a symphony of distant sirens, murmuring crowds, and the occasional honk from impatient drivers. Neon lights flickered against wet pavement, their colors stretching and twisting across the glistening streets. The scent of rain still lingered in the air, mixing with exhaust fumes and the faint aroma of flowers from Clara's stall. Liam stood before her, hands in the pockets of his tailored coat, his presence effortless yet commanding. He was a man used to control, to effortless negotiation, to getting exactly what he wanted. And what he wanted in this moment was something he didn't understand. His instincts as a businessman kicked in. Solve the problem. Make an offer. Close the deal. He reached into his wallet, fingers brushing over crisp $100 bills. Money had always been his most efficient tool, efficient and indisputable. It cut through obstacles, erased hesitations, bought compliance. He didn't hesitate. Triple the price. Every flower. The world slowed for a beat. The offer hung in the air like a baited hook. But Clara, she didn't bite. She didn't react with gratitude, nor excitement. No flicker of hesitation. Instead, she simply stared. The dim glow of the street lamp above them cast a shadow over her expression, making her unreadable. The only thing clear was the sharp, calculating gaze that met his. Then, she did something Liam never expected. She shook her head. A refusal. It took him a second to process. Liam Carter was not a man who got turned down. Not in the boardroom, not in negotiations, not ever. Yet here she was. This girl, standing before him in her worn-out sweater and scuffed boots, refusing not just his money but the very principle behind it. Something flickered in her expression. Not defiance, not hostility, a quiet, unshakable conviction. She wasn't selling these flowers for charity. She wasn't here to accept handouts. Every bloom, every dollar, every moment spent on this street. It meant something to her. And suddenly, Liam felt small. For the first time in his life, money wasn't enough. He wasn't enough. Clara calmly turned her attention back to her flowers, as if the conversation was already over, as if he had never even been there. And Liam, for the first time in a long, long time, didn't know what to do next. Morning in New York had its own rhythm, different from the electric chaos of the night before, but no less alive. The city stretched and stirred beneath the early sunlight, golden rays slicing through the skyline like brushstrokes on a glass canvas. Pedestrians shuffled past in hurried strides, coffee cups clutched in one hand, phones in the other. Taxis honked impatiently. The world, relentless as ever, continued its but for Liam Carter. This morning was different. He wasn't in a boardroom negotiating million-dollar deals. He wasn't checking stock prices or dictating emails to his assistant. He wasn't where he was supposed to be. Instead, he was here. Standing at the edge of a small flower stall on a quiet street corner, watching a woman who had refused him with a Clara. She was already at work, arranging flowers with an effortless grace, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. She wasn't just selling flowers, she was curating something more. Each stem placed just so, each color complementing another, as if she were painting a masterpiece made of petals and fragrance. Liam could see it now, the way she handled them, not as products, but as something alive. A florist might call it an arrangement. A businessman might call it a transaction. But to Clara, it was something else entirely. Liam took a breath, then stepped forward. This time he didn't watch from a distance. He moved to the side of the stall, hands in his pockets, and for the first time in a long time, he simply observed. No rush, no need to speak, just silence. Clara didn't acknowledge him, didn't even glance his way. Her attention was on the flowers, as if the presence of a millionaire CEO meant nothing in her world. The realization stung more than it should have. And yet, Liam didn't leave. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way she adjusted each stem with careful deliberation, as if every tiny detail mattered. Or maybe it was the way the morning light caught strands of her hair, turning them to gold. Or the way she existed, so completely, so unapologetically, in a world that had no space for pretension. For the first time in his life, Liam Carter was captivated by something that had no price tag. A soft breeze stirred the air, carrying the scent of roses and lilies. A petal drifted loose, floating gently to the ground between them. Liam bent down and picked it up. It was small, delicate, so easily crushed, yet somehow it had survived the wind, the city, the chaos of everything around it. And as he held it in his hand, he realized something unsettling. Maybe, just maybe. He had never truly paid attention to anything before this moment. Morning had settled over the city, but in this part of town, it felt different. The towering skyscrapers were replaced by narrow streets lined with old brick buildings, their facades worn by time and weather. The scent of fresh flowers mingled with the dampness of the morning air, creating an aroma that felt oddly real. Liam Carter wasn't used to places like this. He was accustomed to polished floors and air-conditioned lobbies, to boardrooms where power was measured in eye contact and silence. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of a bustling flower market, surrounded by color, movement, and voices that spoke a language he had never bothered to understand. Clara weaved through the chaos like she belonged here. Because she did. Her hands skimmed over petals, fingers brushing against stems with a familiarity that came from years of experience. She moved with purpose, selecting each flower with a careful eye, as if she could hear something in them that others couldn't. A conversation between her and the blooms. Liam followed, his presence awkward, out of place. People bustled past him, baskets filled with lavender, roses, and peonies. Vendors called out prices, haggled over scents. It was a rhythm, a life force of its own, one that had nothing to do with balance sheets or quarterly profits, and he had no idea how to fit into it. At one point, Clara paused. A vendor, an older woman with sun-worn hands, handed her a bundle of white lilies wrapped in newspaper. Clara gave a small nod of gratitude, slipping a few bills into the woman's palm before tucking the flowers into her basket. Liam watched. It wasn't a transaction. It wasn't just business. There was trust there, an unspoken bond. And for the first time, he realized that the world Clara lived in operated on something far more fragile than contracts and wealth. It ran on respect, on integrity, on understanding. Clara barely acknowledged him as she moved forward, but Liam felt something shift inside himself. Because in this world, her world, money meant nothing. The news reached Clara on an ordinary afternoon. The kind of afternoon where the sun spilled golden light through the tangled streets, and the scent of freshly watered flowers clung to the warm pavement. She had spent the morning arranging bouquets, her hands moving with the precision of someone who knew every petal, every stem by heart. Then, the words came. At first they didn't register. A neighbor, an old florist from the market, mentioned it in passing, how the new flower shop on the corner had been bought under her name. A charming little place, prime location, already paid for. Clara's fingers froze over a bundle of white lilies. She didn't need to ask who was behind it. Liam. A strange weight settled in her chest, something between disbelief and fury. She turned, staring blankly at the bustling street, her mind racing. She had worked for years, pushing through cold winters, scorching summers, never asking for handouts, never expecting anything but what her own hands could earn. And now, this? A store, bought for her like she was some kind of charity case. The betrayal burned slow, like a flame licking at the edges of old paper. By the time she reached Liam, the city had already started to glow with the first lights of evening. He was waiting for her, standing tall in his usual way, confident, assured, like a man who was used to fixing things with money. But money couldn't fix this. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes said enough. Liam's certainty wavered, just for a moment. He had thought he was helping. He had imagined her stepping into that store, arranging flowers in a place of her own, free from the biting wind and the endless bargaining of the street. But he had taken something from her without even realizing it. Her fight, her pride, her independence. Clara took a slow step back. Then another. And before Liam could say anything, before he could explain or undo what had already been done, she walked away. Leaving him standing there, watching her disappear into the city, drowning in a regret that money could never buy his way out of. The end didn't come suddenly. It wasn't a single catastrophic event, no explosion that shattered his world in an instant. No, it was slower, crueler, a series of tiny fractures, each one spreading wider, deeper, until the inevitable collapse. Liam Carter had always lived with certainty. He controlled every aspect of his world, never allowing chaos to seep through the cracks. His empire had been built on power, precision, and the ruthless ability to see 10 steps ahead of everyone else. But even kings fall. It started with whispers, small, seemingly insignificant shifts in the market, investors pulling back, silent hesitations during meetings, the way his top executives avoided his eyes. At first, he dismissed it. Fluctuations were part of the game. He had survived worse. Then came the calls. The first was from the board. A loss of confidence. He had always considered them nothing more than an advisory panel, useful but not powerful enough to challenge him. But the tone in their voices told him otherwise. The second was from his attorneys. A hostile takeover. Someone had been waiting in the shadows, watching, waiting for the moment his grip loosened. They had moved swiftly, ruthlessly, seizing the cracks in his empire before he could stop them. The third call was the final nail in the coffin. His company, the entity he had poured every ounce of his soul into, was no longer his. The contracts were signed, the assets were reassigned, and Liam Carter, the man who once sat at the top of a billion-dollar empire, was now just another casualty of the corporate battlefield. But the true devastation didn't come in that moment. It came later. That night, as he stepped into his penthouse, a fortress of glass and steel towering over the city, everything felt different. The space was exactly as he had left it. The leather-bound books still lined the shelves. The artwork still hung in perfect symmetry. The whiskey decanter on his desk was still half full. But it felt empty. Not in the physical sense. Not in the way furniture could be replaced or lights could be turned on to chase away the darkness. It was something else. Something deeper. A hollow ache settled in his chest as he stood in the middle of the vast, pristine living room. His empire was gone. His power, gone. But worse than that, he was alone. He reached for his phone, scrolling mindlessly through his contacts. Names of people who had once clung to him, sought his approval, fought for his time. His attorneys, his executives, his so-called friends. None of them mattered now. And then he saw it. Clara. Her name sat there, a silent reminder of the one thing he had lost before his company. The woman who had never wanted anything from him, except the one thing he had been too afraid to give. He remembered the way she had looked at him that night, after he had tried to fix things for her. The way her hands had trembled, not with fear, but with rage. The sharpness in her voice when she told him he had taken away her choice. The pain in her eyes when she walked away. She had seen him for what he was, a man who thought he could buy his way out of everything. And she had left before the rest of the world did. Liam let out a slow breath, leaning against the cold glass of the window. Below him, the city pulsed with life. People moved, cars sped past, lights flickered in the distance. The world kept turning, indifferent to his downfall. For the first time in his life, there was no next move, no strategy, no backup plan, no way to buy his way out. He had spent his entire life building an empire, and now he had nothing. Nothing but the weight of his own mistakes. The early morning sky still carried the lingering chill of the night. The glow of the streetlights faded, making way for the first golden rays slipping through the towering buildings. The city was waking up, people rushing, cars lining up along congested streets, and sidewalk cafes filling with customers waiting in line for their morning coffee. But amidst the chaos, in a quiet corner of the city, there was an image that didn't belong. A man, tall, his hair slightly disheveled from a sleepless night, dressed in clothes so simple he was almost unrecognizable, stood silently beside a worn-out basket overflowing with flowers. Liam Carter. Once a powerful CEO, accustomed to million-dollar deals and extravagant galas. But now, he was just a man selling flowers. No one paid him any attention. People walked past as if he were invisible, the same way they had always ignored Clara. At first, he thought simply standing there would be enough, that everything would somehow fall into place. But reality hit him differently. The morning air was sharp, sending a cold gust through the streets, making the petals in his basket quiver. A middle-aged woman paused for a moment, her eyes briefly scanning the flowers, but she moved on before Liam could even open his mouth. A young man hesitated, seemingly about to ask something, but after one look at Liam, clearly out of place as a street vendor, he just shrugged and kept walking. Liam was beginning to understand what it meant to be overlooked. Every time he spoke, every time he tried to sell a flower, he was met with either a polite shake of the head or a confused glance. His pride, which had once been his armor, was now being chipped away, piece by piece. He looked down at the flowers in his basket. Soft, delicate petals, each one fragile yet carrying its own worth, a worth that not everyone could see. So this is what Clara had endured all these years. A dry leaf tumbled across the pavement, caught in a swirl of wind before drifting away. Liam pulled his scarf tighter around his neck, his gaze lifting towards the street corner. And then he saw her. Clara. She was walking slowly along the sidewalk across the street, her head slightly bowed, arms wrapped around a cloth tote bag. She wasn't looking for him. She had no idea he was even here. But then she stopped. Her eyes met his. The world seemed to freeze. The rush of traffic, the distant hum of conversations, the clatter of footsteps, all of it faded. In that moment, there were only two of them. Liam didn't say a word. He didn't move forward. He simply stood there, allowing her to see him in whatever way she chose. Clara studied him for a long time. She watched the way he stood, the way he held the flowers, the way the morning light reflected in his eyes, no longer with arrogance, no longer with the distant indifference of a man who once had everything. Instead, there was something different. A man who was finally learning to understand something he had never understood before. Clara's grip tightened around the straps of her bag. A soft breeze passed between them, lifting a few strands of her hair across her face. She could walk away. She could ignore him, just as he had once ignored her. But instead, she took a step closer. Just a few steps. Close enough to see that in Liam's eyes there was no deception. And for the first time, she truly saw him. Dawn crept through the towering skyscrapers, painting the sky in soft shades of amber, its golden glow reflecting off the shimmering glass windows. The city was still waking up, but the streets were already stirring. Car horns echoed in the distance, and the steady hum of hurried footsteps filled the air as if life had never once paused. Yet, in a quiet corner of the city, on a sidewalk still damp with the night's lingering mist, there was a moment of absolute stillness. Liam was still standing there. He no longer noticed the passing crowd, nor did he care about the curious glances thrown his way. All he could feel now was the cold pavement pressing into the soles of his shoes, the faint floral fragrance drifting from the basket before him, and the weight of his own heartbeat. Slow and heavy, as if waiting for something far more significant than any decision he had ever made. And then, Clara approached. No rush, no hesitation. Just quiet, measured steps, each one like the soft pulse of a heartbeat against the silent backdrop of the city. A gentle breeze swept through, catching the loose strands of her hair, but she made no effort to push them aside. She simply stood there, facing Liam, her eyes as bright and unwavering as the first night he had seen her. But today, there was something different in them. Liam said nothing. He wasn't sure if he should, but he didn't have to. Clara lowered her gaze to the basket of flowers. White roses still kissed by the morning dew, their fragile petals carrying an undeniable strength. Slowly, gently, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against the bouquet in Liam's hands. No urgency, no hesitation. She took it. In that moment, no words were needed, because they both understood. There was no longer a divide between two opposing worlds. No misunderstandings, no wounds left unhealed, no fears left unspoken. Liam was no longer a businessman who measured life in terms of power and wealth. He had finally learned something he had never known before, that not everything could be bought, that some things only held meaning when cherished. Clara was no longer the girl who kept everyone at a distance. She had realized that letting someone into her life didn't mean losing herself, but rather discovering something deeper. Amidst the moving crowd, in the heart of a city that never slept, they stood together, silent as if the world had faded into the background. No promises needed to be made, no declarations had to be spoken. Only an unspoken understanding, profound, enduring. A love that did not begin with wealth, but with transformation. A journey that was not an ending, but the beginning of something new.